Hey everyone, this is BT, ear candy for your holiday road trips. We're going meta on this particular episode, and we're talking about some of the podcasts that David and I listen to, why we listen, and why maybe you should be listening too. I thought it might be fun to go through some of our favorite listens, both podcasts and audiobooks, and give you some guidance on what to listen to on your upcoming holiday road trips. So do yourself a favor, come and listen to this episode. I think you're going to dig it.
Successful people learn how to make their mind work for them. I'm David Nagel, and this is the Successful Mind Podcast.
All right, so here we are back in studio. David.
Back.
Good to have this conversation with you today. We're going to talk a little bit. We're going to go meta today. So for all the young kids out there who know what I'm talking about, this is a boomer kind of guy talking to you about meta. We're going to talk a little bit about podcasts on this podcast.
Yeah.
Not just podcasts, but basically things that we listen to and things that you listen to. And I believe that the way this conversation could go is that there's a lot of people right now who are getting ready to travel for the holidays. You know, we're a few weeks out from when, many people are making long road trips. And, it used to be commonplace for people to go about their business and listen to the radio when they were driving down the road. It seems like nowadays more and more people are turning to podcast listening or audiobook listening. Yeah. And one of the biggest questions we oftentimes get from listeners of this show and people who, basically know you and work with you is, what is David reading right now? Or what is David listening to? Because they know you've sort of made the transition more to audio listening than to actually reading the physical books.
I could get through it much faster.
Yeah, totally. So I think what would be a good idea to do as people get set to embark on these, long road trips to see family, talk a little bit about some of the, recent audiobooks or podcasts you're listening to, maybe why you're listening and what you're getting from those. So let's jump in.
So with the podcasts, I listen for two reasons. Some are interest, some is learning. So there's certain people that I watch that I pick to study for a while to learn from. How they interview, how they run the podcast, their patterns of speech, the rhythm of the podcast. Sometimes I'm fascinated by the amount of listeners they have versus the topics that they talk about, which is always interesting because, what was it, 4 years ago when we started the podcast here and you and I started studying it.
Right.
I was so blown away by the vast topic range, and
sure.
then you were telling me like, there's true crime that's at the head of the list, and then there's the guy that tells the scary stories.
Yes.
What was that one called?
Yeah, Lore. Yeah, with
Yeah.
Aaron Mahnke, he made a career out of it. He was just doing it part-time as a podcaster, and he still had a job that he was working, and he was doing this on the side, and then he got so big so fast that he ended up quitting his job, and now he's got multiple podcasts, and that's just how he generates his income. So that was Lore with Aaron Mahnke, actually so much so that we loved his show so much that we bought tickets to see a live show of his down here in Charlotte a few years back. So it's really interesting to see the various genres that can be covered, not only in what you do with, helping people discover a successful mindset, but like you said, true crime and sports talk and all manners of things. And when you started this show back in 2018, we're coming up on our I guess it'd be our 4-year anniversary once the new year comes into play. There were still a ton of podcasts, but it wasn't as many as there are now. There's new podcasts being released every day, like probably thousands of them. And, it's a testament to being able to stick it out because you got to have something to say and people have to listen to it.
And even with as many podcasts as there was still only there was some weird number, like only 50% of the people in the country knew that podcasts even existed.
Right.
Just a few years ago.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. I used to do a presentation for one of your groups that you had where there was some alarming statistics that people didn't even know they had it on their phone. Like I had my mom, I was trying to get my mom into listening to some, maybe listen to some podcasts about certain things. She loves to, learn about new things or, learn about sports or whatever it might be. And her first question was, well, how much does it cost? And I said, well, it doesn't cost anything. And she said, okay, where do I get it? She's like, well, it's been on your phone. You just bought this iPhone. I think she still has an iPhone 4, but back in the day, she still had this iPhone. And I'm like, well, why don't you just open this up and here's this podcast app. And then you can go in and then you can subscribe. And then every week it'll show up. And over time, she learned to listen. She listened to this show. She listened to another podcast that my daughter and I did. And it was just a way for people to understand that it's available to them when they didn't really even know. I mean, this generation of older people, they're used to, 2 or 3 channels on the television and the local radio station, both AM and FM. They had no idea that this whole podcast world even existed. And nowadays, I mean, it's very, very common. I think more and more people are becoming aware that it's at your fingertips, and more people are diving into it. And it's sort of supplanting radio as the new way to listen to things.
Right. Yeah. There's no question about it.
Yeah. But I love that you say you listen to learn. You know what I mean? Like, so for me, just to let you know, I listen to podcasts. A lot of mine are entertainment podcasts. They like Hollywood actors interviewing other Hollywood actors. I'm a big fan of like Conan O'Brien because of his humor and the people he brings in. But I do like the stories that are told that you don't always hear. Like, when McConaughey was making the rounds when he wrote Green Lights last year, you and I were having a conversation like it's the same conversation he's having. Yeah, he's on 25, 30 different podcasts, but it's sort of like this elevator pitch conversation that he does.
Yeah, it's a pitch.
But when you do the long forms, like you recently did one with a gentleman by the name of Nico Jenkins who came in and you guys spoke for 90 minutes, you start to feel the magic that comes when a certain time limit is breached and there's a really good conversation happening and people tend to chill, which is I think why, you sort of turned me on to Joe Rogan, who's considered to be one of the kings of the podcasting world because of his early adoption, but also because he brings in the most diverse and eclectic group of people ever. I mean, he's got such a massive reach. I just think it's cool that you listen to learn. I just kind of listen to get through. So maybe we could talk a little bit about that too.
Yeah. So, the thing is that, I'm a student that I'm always wanting to make things better, to continue to learn. And the interesting thing about podcasting is, for the most part, podcast is a long-term investment. If you want to have a successful podcast, you have to be willing to put in the at-bats, as Vaynerchuk would say, right? And that means you got to put the time in. So if you think about how many podcasts does an average person do on a regular basis, are you learning once a month? Are you doing a podcast once a month? Are you doing one once a week? Are you doing one once a day? The more you're doing, the more you're learning. However, in order to speed up that learning, if you're paying attention to other people that are successful with their podcast and really paying attention to what they're doing, because I think that's one of the interesting things. Like when you listen to a podcast that you really like, and you look at one that's really successful, you get engaged in the content of the podcast, the topic of the podcast, perhaps the guest of the podcast, the dialogue that's going back and forth. But you're not paying attention as to what's actually happening, right? That there's a skill set that's present there, and a very important skill set.
Absolutely.
If you go back and look at Joe Rogan, if you look in the beginning when he first started his podcast, his personality was very different. He was very high strung. He talked very fast. He interrupted a lot. He had not really cultivated the ability to listen yet and to hold a very calm dialogue. He also was reactionary. And I actually heard him talk about this, that it took him a long time to learn not to get so emotionally involved in what another person was thinking, what they're saying. Sure. Because he didn't want the podcast to be combative. He wanted it to be informational. Like, he is a very curious person. And like you said, he has people from every walk of life, every side of every agenda, basically on the podcast with all different interests. And if you watch, if you would even spot watch 10 episodes of his podcast, you'll see that he is very even keel almost all the time, unless he cracks up. He's
Sure.
laughing, or if they're getting high or drunk on the podcast,
they're engaging in illicit substances while taping. Yes,
exactly. But generally, when it's a serious conversation, if you're paying attention, he's very even keel. And I think that most people would be sitting there watching that and not realize that that's a skill that Joe cultivated.
Sure.
When I first recognized that, I started looking at different conversations that I would be involved in as I was involved in the conversation. And I could see where I would get emotionally involved in the conversation, that my energy might change, the way that I'm communicating might change. And I thought, that's fascinating, because if you don't learn to control that, then you pull a bias within the podcast. It's fine if that's what you want your podcast to be. Do you want it to be combative? Do you want it to be argumentative? Do you want it to be high drama? That's fine if that's what you want. But if you're looking to do something different, if you want to bring different topics to a podcast where you can allow people to see different sides of things like Joe does, then you have to kind of run down the middle of the road. Now, Joe doesn't, he'll if he disagrees, he'll disagree, but he doesn't get crazy about his disagreement. He has a conversation about it. And that is much easier said than done.
Sure.
You have got to work at that. So I'm looking at different podcasts that have high viewership across several different topics. And I'm interested in two things. Sometimes I'm interested in the topic, and I'm almost always interested in how they're conducting the podcast. What is their communication skill? What is their speaking skill? What do I like about the podcast? What don't I like about the podcast? What do I like about the guests? What don't I like about the guests? And I'm asking myself, as a listener, as I'm sitting there listening, what am I finding intriguing about this? What makes me want to sit and listen to a 3-hour podcast, right? Because this is another fascinating thing. You're totally not the 3-hour podcast.
I am not.
Right?
I'm more of a short form. Although when you tell me to listen to a Rogan episode that is in that length, I will move mountains to listen to it, because there's a reason you want me to listen to it. Yeah, totally.
There's a reason. So because I have been listening to audiobooks since the early 90s, right? Because it was an interesting thing. In the very beginning, when I first started to study, the time that I had to be able to put in to study was in the car. I drove 100 miles to work one way, right? So 200 miles a day. That's at least 90 minutes per trip.
Yeah, that's 3-hour round
3
tripper.
hours. So I turned that 3 hours into study time every single frickin' day. But the way to do it was to get books on tape.
Right.
Right. Now, there were books on tape, right? They're not as many as there are today, but you could get books on tape. You could get seminars on tape. You could get lectures on tape. You could get biographies. Anyway, I jammed and jammed and jammed and jammed. And then when I could, I would read. But what I found over the years was that in order to read, I got to put the time aside to do it. And in order to listen to an audiobook or a podcast, for that matter, I can do it in different blank spots in my day. I could do it between a meeting. I could do it driving to work, driving home from work. I could do it. I could do it while I'm doing other things. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Like I can do it while I'm working, and I can get through a lot more information by listening than I can by actually physically reading, because you can't do anything else if you're physically reading.
Right, that's it.
Right.
You got the book in your hands. That's all you can be doing. You can't be driving. Please don't drive while you're reading a book. You can't be mowing the lawn while you're reading a book. You can't be, you need to be fully dedicated to the physical print, whereas you have the ability to listen and you can put it down and pick right back up with no loss of, I better rewind it. You've got that skill. Is that something you cultivated?
Yeah, it is.
Okay,
it is.
nice.
It's for doing it for so long. I just I think when I've been listening to learn for 30 years now. So I cultivated the skill to listen. I'm a very, very good listener.
Well, and you maintain information rather quickly.
If I'm interested in it.
Yeah.
So there's a truth about that and a non-truth.
Okay.
The truth is, if I'm interested in something, I have almost a photogenic memory, right? If I'm not, it's like I can't remember
In and out,
anything.
in
It's
one and out.
in and out. It doesn't stick.
Sure.
It's like everything in my brain goes later.
I think that's for most people too. Like I withhold really dumb information, but I can't tell you, what I did last week on Tuesday. You know what I mean? Like if it's interesting, I can hold on to it. But even then I'm spotty. But yeah, for you to be able to say that, I would say your photographic memory for things that you can pull dates and certain things out and you remember where you were and what was happening at the time when you heard this. And then there's other times where it's like, it just goes in one ear and out the other. And I think that's the noise of podcasts too. There's so many people that are out there having conversations. If it's not engaging enough to me, I'll still listen. Very rarely do I stop. This is kind of a quirk of mine. If I start a podcast, I have to finish it. It's my OCD kicks in. But I'm sure you're one of those people that if you start listening and if it's not for you, you move on and go to the next.
Yeah.
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 That's pretty cool.
Yeah. So there, there's different topics that I'm interested in. I'm interested enough in what's going on in our world that I jump around to different podcasts to listen to different points of view, because so much of it is bullshit. Even the podcasts now. I mean, the thing about podcasts is now people are bringing the entertainment factor into podcasting.
Yes. Trying to separate themselves because in order for you really have to bring a reality television to it, or they believe you need to bring reality TV to be able to cut through the noise so people can find you. So you really have to be the, infotainment people. Yeah,
exactly. So there's people that I can see that they started off they started off trying to be like journalists, trying to give the news as straight as possible. And I don't even know if they realize that they're doing this, but as time is going on, they're becoming more and more hyperbolic about the way that they give it and the drama that they create with it and the narrative that they create, and it's more of their own story and opinion in what's happening, which is fine. It's their podcast. They can do whatever they want. But that's the problem that we have with our news. That's why nobody listens to our news anymore.
Yeah, so if they're not going to listen during the news, they're not going to listen to you doing that sort of thing. Like if that's what the idea behind, like you said, the idea behind your podcast is to be polarizing and just give your angle, then that's great. But don't expect everybody to be on board and listen.
Yeah, exactly. And part of the problem is that there is still such an enormous group of people that think that our news is true, and very little of it is actually truth or based in truth. It's all based in narrative and the slant that one side wants to play over another.
Yeah.
And it's egregious at this point. It is completely, what we've seen happen is literally go completely over the edge, tell lies that they know are lies in order to sell more news, to sell more sponsorships, to sell more advertising, to win more for their political side. And if they get called on it, they'll make an apology a week later, but it's too late because everybody heard the drama. They all heard the lie. They all heard the fear. That's already in people's minds, and people get addicted to it.
Yeah.
And they start doing it. So I try to stay away from podcasts that do that. I'm just not interested. I'm looking for as much factual evidence as possible. So one of the things that I'll do is if there's a topic that I am interested in, even if it's a political topic, I may look for podcasts where they have specific speakers that are very well educated on the topic talking. So then that's what I'll look for, right? And if I find one where they're actually shooting straight or they're coming close to shooting straight, I might listen for informational purposes. But most of what I'm listening to currently, because I have a few topics that I listen to just for the topics because I'm interested in, but then the rest of it that I'm looking for is completely learning. Yeah. Right. So I'll always try to find something that I enjoy listening to at the same time. But it's learning from skill. And the thing is about this, this is what's unbelievable. Because there's so many podcasts going on, the amount of skill that you can absorb if you're willing to put the time in is like none other ever in the history of our world.
Right at your fingertips.
It's right at your fingertips.
Yeah.
You have all of these different personalities doing all of these different subjects in their own unique way. And normally, I mean, the way we were raised, if you were exposed to one person that could be a mentor that you could watch. I mean, like, so when we were kids, Johnny Carson, The Tonight Show.
Sure.
If you wanted to see a good interview, you had Phil Donahue, Michael Douglas, Johnny Carson. That's what it was when we were really little, right? So if you wanted to learn, you were learning just from those three guys. And if you didn't like two of them, you were only learning from one, right? And even that was in very segmented bits. You know, they're only 3-4 minutes long
they're short
at the most, and then they break for a 5-minute freaking commercial, and then they're back. So you're picking up a little bit. Podcast blew all of that out of the water, and you have people talking anywhere from 30 minutes to 3 hours, and you're learning that there's a skill set that takes place and a transference of energy and information that takes place over that period of time, and you could learn from thousands of people that are actually good at it, right? And you can, and here's what's good about it, because I may look at somebody and I may be like, this person freaking rocks this podcast. But part of the reason that I like them is that I like their personality. You may hate their personality.
It's not for you.
Right? And you can't learn from the person that you hate their personality.
Right.
So you got to learn from somebody that, you know, it's what your personality is, because I think the most important thing about these podcasts is that you be you. You don't try to be Rogan. Don't try to be Adam Carolla. Don't try to be Tim Dillon. Don't try to be Lex Friedman. Don't try to be Jocko Willink. Don't try to be
something you're not.
Something you are not, right? Learn from what they're doing and then take that and say, okay, here's something that I think is really cool about this podcast and the way they do this. How can I make this my own?
Yeah.
How can I turn that into, like, how would I do that from my personality? Right. I mean, this is interesting. I was actually watching last night. I was watching I guess it's a podcast. It's maybe not a podcast, but it was on YouTube. And it was an interview that Paul McCartney did 3 days ago for a book that he put together about all the lyrics that he wrote over his career.
Okay.
So they composited all the lyrics, they put all the stories with the lyrics, what was going on in his life, what he thought, why, you know, what they mean to the best that he can recall, this and that. And they interviewed him for over an hour. Whatever publishing company is putting this out, the guy interviewed him for over an hour. And I don't remember the name of the publishing company. If I heard it, I would remember it. But so I'm watching this and I was like, oh, let's see how he does with this. I really was interested to see how he does with it. And I thought that he did fine. But what was interesting about it was that as he was talking about his songs and how he wrote his music, and the guy was asking him questions about it, he said, well, what were your inspirations? And, you know, Paul would say, well, it could be like this person. Maybe I was listening to Adam Ginsberg at the time, or I was listening to the Beat Poets, or I was listening to what was going on in politically or whatever. And he said, oh, so you'll read poetry. And he says, oh yeah, I've always read poetry to some degree. He said, and that you'll get ideas from poetry. And he'll say, you know, whenever we were in the studio or whenever I was writing, I would always have some kind of book of poetry with me close by. And if I would get stuck on a lyric, I would open up the book and I would start reading. I would look for like word salad. I would look for stuff that get my mind going. And if I found a couple sentences that really worked within that lyric, I wouldn't copy the poet, but I would take it and say, how can I turn this into mine? How would Paul say this, right? And I thought, you know, that's fascinating, because that's the way that it's actually done. You know, you take something and you're like, I like this. This is really cool. You don't want to plagiarize, but how do I take this and make this something that's actually mine?
I mean, there's so many ideas. And I'm not saying there's no original ideas left, but everybody since the dawn of time has been taking what someone else says and improving upon it, you know. So you bring up McCartney, who probably got his inspiration from certain things, but then he makes it his own. He brings his own vulnerabilities. He brings his own insecurities. He brings how he would say things into a lyric and makes it his own. He's not just ripping it off, but he is borrowing from other people for inspiration. And I think that's the people with podcasts. It's a platform that comes with a responsibility. You have a responsibility, and I'll be the first one to admit we make a ton of mistakes on this show. My fact checking isn't always 100% accurate.
Yeah.
I will fully own that, but the reality is that, you know, we're open and honest about it. We make mistakes, we try to clean them up as best we can, but we are trying to show a vulnerable side, an authentic side. Because like you said, I love that you bring up authenticity in a podcast. Whoever you're listening to, you know, for me, if they've got 100 listeners or 100 million, for me, it's, are they able to connect with me, and are they able to be authentic and vulnerable? They're not just perfect. We're not all perfect in this world. And I think that's what's cool about podcasts. If you've got, you know, a microphone and a recording device, you can turn it on and you can start a podcast today. There's really nothing to get started. But the reality is you won't be in the game long unless you have a repeated situation where you're doing it. Looking back on the early days of the show, if you go back and listen to the very beginning, for the first year, we did it once a week. And it felt like at the time that was a lot, juggling all your events, all your travel, all your speaking engagement, not to mention you also work with clients privately. So being able to sit in a small room around a table and record that once a week, that was a monumental feat. And then very quickly thereafter, we ramped up to 3 times a week and then to 5 times a week. And we did 5 times a week for the better part of a year or more. Yeah. So to see where we went at the beginning to where we are now, it's sort of similar to probably what Rogan went through when he was first beginning. We weren't fully formed. And now we're still learning, and we're able to say, look, this is not perfect, but we're getting there every single time.
And the reason that we went to 5 a week was to accomplish 2 things: to get better faster.
Yes.
And to get the podcast better faster, to get it out to more people.
It's reps. If you want to get big, you know, you want to bulk up, do some reps.
For me.
Yeah.
And so I went and I talked to people, and I got some advice, and somebody told me, listen, you got to put it out constantly.
Yeah, and we did.
If you want it to pick up fast and you want to get better fast, you got to put it out constantly. So we went to 3 days a week, and then 5 days.
Yeah, 5 days a week. And then it's just really cool to see how the show has evolved. And clearly people are listening to this now, and they come here for a reason. They tune in for, you know, your newly dubbed Mindset Mondays, where they get a short little bit to take through them throughout the week. They tune in for your, you know, David from the Stages, or your, you know, like in the past you did What's the Truth, where you answered people's questions. And then, you know, now you're doing more long form interviews like the one you did with Nico Jenkins recently, that's available for people to listen to. So you're getting these, you know, little bits and pieces of great content to take with you and learn from. And you're listening to learn as opposed to listening to get through. I'm more of a listen to get through it. Let's clean out the feed and move on. I love that you take that listen to learn piece, because you can learn from every single person. Every podcast in your feed. Person. Yeah, there's something that you can take from you.
Even if I said I don't want to listen to this person.
Exactly. You know that. And I think that's really cool. But, you know, I was thinking back to when you were talking about this, and I was looking back on the years when I started listening, because really the evolution of podcasts for me came from listening to audiobooks on long road trips. You know, I would travel between Montana and California back in the late 90s, and I would listen to audiobooks. And then when I was in Wisconsin and leaving teaching, I was listening to books on tape in between my commutes, like listening to The Secret or listening to Law of Attraction, things that you would provide. I made, you know, comments on this show before about how you used to be in my ear when I would mow the lawn, because I would listen to your interpretation of the science of getting rich or Think and Grow Rich. And I would listen while I was doing, because I felt like I was able to take in more information. That was a listening to learn situation. So the evolution from audiobooks to now into podcasts, and even Audible totally blew my mind. Like getting all my audiobooks from Audible now, I can be listening in one moment. I can be listening to, you know, Alice Cooper talk about, you know, recently I listened to him do a short form book about 2 hours long, talked about stories he really never told anybody else. And I can flip it over to listen to Ron Howard talk about his boyhood as Opie from the Andy Griffith Show. Like, I just love that is available at your fingertips. And I too am into biographies, and I too am into just people telling really cool stories. And I think that's what this is about.
I'm currently reading another biography. It's been out for about 10 or 12 years, I think. It's a John Lennon biography.
Okay. So you're hitting the Beatles hard right now.
Well, I happened to watch the Get Back documentary,
Yeah.
which I thought was absolutely
Looks
fantastic.
beautiful. Haven't seen it yet.
It's over 6 hours.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a lot of footage. And I mean, some of it you could look at and be like, okay, this is kind of dry. They're just, sitting there for half an hour watching them work out a song. But there's a lot to learn there if a person's interested in learning. So I'm reading John Lennon, The Life. I read it when it first came out.
Okay.
It's been a long time since I read it. So I'm reading that again. I'll give you a couple of books.
Yeah, throw a couple our way. Well, I did want to bring back, you talked about Paul McCartney's The Lyrics book that just recently came out, 1956 to the present.
Right.
The hardcover is available. They don't have an audio version of that from what I can tell just yet, but it looks like this really slick box that comes with this, and it looks massive. That just came out.
Who was the publisher of
November.
that again?
I'm not
W,
quite sure. It looks like I can't really tell, excerpted in the New Yorker, Washington Post notable book. I don't know who the publisher is, but man, does it look killer. And if you're a Beatles fan, that would be a great, you can't listen to that one though. That's a little tricky to take on your road trips, but.
Yeah. Okay. Here's a book. So I just told you about the one that I'm currently going through.
The John Lennon.
Another one that I read was Rigged, How the Media, Big Tech, let's see here. Rigged, How the Media, Big Tech, and the Democrats Seized Our Elections by Molly Hemingway.
Okay.
So I read things, just so people know, that are both sides of the issue.
Totally.
So don't
it's
take
smart.
Yeah. Yeah. Because you learn from both sides.
And the fact that you're able to listen and hear both sides, I think, is a testament.
The thing is that I heard a lot about that book, and I wanted to hear what that person had to say about that book. Now, I will tell you, I just read Gary Vaynerchuk's new book, 12 and a Half.
Oh, sure. How was that?
Fantastic.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, he did a great
He usually churns out some pretty quality content for sure. I love that stuff. And he's been on this show as well. Go back and find go back and find that episode. It's a great one.
Yeah. Gary's a good friend. So, let's see. What else have I read lately that's good?
I usually love it when you bring in like musical biographies and stuff. Do you ever do fiction?
No, I don't. Very, very rarely. Very rarely.
Yeah, you're all. Fiction.
I read not that long ago. I read The Heroin Diaries by Nikki Sixx,
yes.
and I read. Let's see, what was his new book called?
The First 21.
The First 21.
Yeah, that was solid. I listened to that one. That was good.
Well,
I know I got you to listen to the Sally Fields In Pieces. I thought that was a great book too.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Because I just loved watching Smokey and the Bandit back in the day. That was a good quality one. Really interesting stories, things I'd never heard before.
Yeah.
12 Rules for Life, Jordan Peterson. I'm just kind of going through my list right here too. Relentless by Tim Grover. Like these are great long drive
by Tim
listening.
Grover. I read.
Winning. Winning.
Dylan, the biography of
right.
I loved it. It was fantastic. Like I think I went through it twice.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I went through that one twice.
Do you like it when the author narrates?
I love it when the author
I do too.
narrates.
I so love it when you get to hear it. Like when I listened to Green Lights last year with Matthew McConaughey, and I was on I think I listened to that a couple of times. I just loved hearing his cadence and hearing him tell these stories because there was a certain energy that came with it that you can't get from anybody else. And I think that I love it when the person who is telling the story is the person who lived in the story. I think that's so very cool. Yeah. There's so much, like I said, The Boys by Ron and Clint Howard was such a great book that I listened to. These are they're not super long. I mean, you can get through them on a couple long road trips. I really feel like the audiobooks and podcasts, you have so much information at your fingertips. You just got to pick and choose what sounds good to you. And we hope that as you're getting set to go off on your holiday, vacations and you're driving great distances or you're flying across country, that you'll plan to take us with you because we take this very seriously here. This platform is something that, you, David, have really worked on and honed and provided people with an excellent listening experience, but also from a content perspective, it's unrivaled. So I think that this hopefully will get people to think about what they want to listen to on their trips.
Absolutely.
And I will say this, I am currently working on a project where I'm throwing together some Spotify playlists. There are some people who listen to podcasts and listen to this podcast on Spotify. So even if you're not a Spotify podcast listener, I'm looking to throw together some podcast playlists that you can take with you, whether they have to do with gratitude, which David, does wonderful talking about that, whether it has to do with dealing with your family around the holidays, or whether it's just going back and listening to some of the high profile interviews that you've done in the past, because you've had some heavy hitters. I mean, you did Gary Vee, you did Jen Sincero, you did Marie Forleo, you did Lisa Nichols. I mean, you did Todd Herman. I mean, Mike McAllowitz. I could just keep going on and on and on about the people you've done. So hopefully I'll have that together when this show drops, and you can go to Spotify, check those out. Link in the notes, hold me to it. That's my accountability, and put it out to the world. So
right on.
This has been really fun. Thanks, David.
You bet.
All right.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for tuning in. We really hope we got you thinking about your upcoming road trips and what you are going to listen to. This could also be looked upon as, if you're not doing a podcast right now, a way to get into it. As David said, you always should be looking to learn from those you listen to. And we hope we teach you things here and there. Like I said in the show, we're not all perfect, but we do our very best to bring you quality content each and every week. Do us a favor, ring that bell down below, like this video, share it with someone who might be interested in or is going on a long road trip here coming up. They'll be able to listen to some quality content as they make their way down the highway. So once again, from all of us here at the Successful Mind Podcast, we will see you next time. Safe travels.
All right.
Thanks for listening to the Successful Mind Podcast. And if you like what you heard and you want to know more, go to davidnagel.com/free stuff.